The first time he saw her, she was trying to light a cigarette with a broken lighter in the wind just outside the university bookstore, muttering under her breath, one heel slightly caught in a sidewalk crack, the tail of her trench coat twisting like a flag in the breeze. Julian watched her from across the courtyard, coffee in hand, half listening to the guy next to him ramble about a sociology paper. She wasn't beautiful the way the girls his age tried to be, curated, symmetrical, smooth-edged. She was fractured, but in a deliberate way. Her lips were a little too thin, the corners of her eyes carved with the kind of lines you earn through crying and laughter and staring down years you wish you could forget. Her hair was swept into an uneven knot, streaked with silver, but it didn't make her old, it made her undeniably present. Alive. The kind of woman who'd buried lovers, cut ties, and still refused to disappear. He crossed the street before he could explain to himself why. Maybe it was the cigarette refusing to light, the cracked heel, the wildness in her frustration. He reached her just as she exhaled a string of curses and tossed the lighter toward the trash, missing by a full foot. "I've got matches," he said, pulling a small cardboard book from his coat pocket and offering it like an apology. She looked up, startled, as if someone had just broken the fourth wall of her solitude. Her eyes landed on him, greenish, faded, but sharp, like stained glass in a ruined cathedral, and she hesitated. Then, a nod, a pause, and she took the matches. When she finally got the cigarette lit, she took one long drag, exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since last year, and offered him the faintest of smirks. "You're too young to be carrying matches," she said. "And you're too smart to be smoking." Touché. That could have been it. A single shared moment, a flick of flame, two people slipping past each other in a city crowded with forgettable encounters. But then she asked, "What are you reading?" and pointed to the book in his hand, which he hadn't realized he'd been holding until she mentioned it. He looked down, embarrassed. "The Myth of Sisyphus." She raised an eyebrow. "Camus. Dangerous for a boy your age." "I like The Punishment," he said without thinking. Something in her paused, really paused, and she looked at him like she was seeing past his age, past his posture in denim jacket and cocky little grin. "Me too," she said. "Sometimes." That night, Julian couldn't stop thinking about her, not the way she looked, but the way she made everything else seem blurry by comparison. He didn't even know her name. He went back the next day to the same spot. And the next. It took 4 afternoons before she showed up again, this time in black sunglasses and a scarf, holding a tote bag full of what looked like manuscripts or maybe student essays. "I'm Julian," he said, standing up before she even reached the steps. She gave a half laugh, like he'd interrupted a joke she hadn't finished telling. "Clara," she replied. "Don't tell me you waited here every day?" "No," he lied. "You're a terrible liar." He shrugged, hands in pockets. "You're a terrible smoker." She laughed then. Not a polite chuckle. A real, unexpected laugh that echoed off the stone walls of the English department building. And as the sound left her lips, he saw it, the crack in her armor, the flicker of something softer, lighter, just beneath the practiced cynicism. A smile that didn't feel like a transaction. The bookstore steps became their unspoken meeting ground. No schedules, no phone numbers. Just coincidence, or maybe fate in disguise. Julian learned she taught literary theory. Adjunct, overworked, underpaid. A fact she delivered with irony and just enough bitterness to reveal old scars. He never asked her age, and she never asked why he kept showing up. They talked books at first, then memories. She told him about a summer in Prague, about the kind of affair that left bruises on your soul. He told her about his father's silence, about how every woman his age sounded like a voice memo. And then one afternoon, it happened. They sat on a bench under the gnarled limbs of an old oak tree, sunlight slanting sideways through the branches, their shadows long and overlapping on the pavement. She was talking about a student who plagiarized an entire essay on feminist ethics, and he was laughing harder than he should have. She looked at him mid-sentence, and something in her face broke open, not with sadness, not with lust, but with relief, as if for the first time in years, the world had given her something back she didn't know she'd lost. A real smile. Unfiltered, unguarded, reckless in its honesty. And Julian, stunned by its arrival, reached out without thinking and brushed a loose strand of hair from her face. She didn't flinch. He didn't pull back. For one breathless second, they hovered there, in the space between impulse and consequence, before she stood too quickly and muttered something about papers to grade. She walked away before he could ask what just happened. But that smile, that goddamn smile, followed him all the way home. Clara hadn't returned to the steps outside the bookstore for 6 days. Julian counted. He sat through 2 downpours and 1 burst of sun glare that gave him a mild headache, but she didn't come. On the 7th day, he stopped waiting, told himself it had been nothing, convinced himself it wasn't personal, that maybe she had gotten busy or sick or lost interest in the flirtation she had allowed for a moment. He focused on school, kind of. Went to class, tuned out lectures, opened his books but didn't really read. She had inserted herself into the rhythm of his life so quietly that he didn't realize what had been disrupted until it was gone. And he hated that. He hated how visible his want was, how stupidly young it made him feel. He also hated how much he checked his phone, even though he didn't have her number. On the 8th day, she was standing in the back of a quiet faculty cafe, wearing jeans and a cardigan, looking down into a cup of coffee like it had told her something she didn't want to hear. He stood in the doorway for a moment before walking toward her. She looked up slowly, and he wasn't sure whether it was guilt, annoyance, or relief that moved through her eyes. "I'm not avoiding you," she said before he could speak. "You're not good at it, then." She shook her head, exhaled something that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're not like the others." Julian sat down across from her without asking, because something in her voice sounded like she wanted someone to. She didn't smile, didn't look away, just stared at him like she was trying to figure out whether to tell him the rest of what she was thinking. "I've been careful. For years. My ex-husband was a lawyer, the arrogant kind who used people's flaws like weapons, especially mine. I made mistakes with him, left my career for him, tried to be someone else, and when I couldn't, he made sure I paid for it." Julian listened without trying to fix her words with comfort, didn't offer her pity, didn't lean forward with pretend empathy. He just stayed still and quiet, which seemed to be the only right thing to do. She took another sip of her coffee, then looked back at him with the kind of focus that made people uneasy. "You're a kid. You probably think this is romantic. I think it's complicated. You don't know what complicated is yet. Try me." She studied him, and the silence between them filled with every unasked question neither of them knew how to place. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a folded letter, slid it across the table. He didn't touch it. He waited. She tapped her finger on the paper like it was a ticking clock. "It's a complaint. From a student. She saw us. Said I was being inappropriate with someone vulnerable. Said I might be using my position. I'm not your student. I know. But you're a student. That's enough. Did you tell them the truth?" "What truth would that be, Julian? That we talked about Camus and broken people and cigarettes and laughed a little too long? That you brushed my hair off my face and I let you? That I smiled like I hadn't in a decade and then ran away before I could decide what it meant?" She leaned back, folded her arms, and looked out the window like she couldn't stand to look at him anymore. The street was quiet, only one car crawling by, but her eyes locked onto it like it was her escape route. He reached for the letter, opened it, skimmed the words. The tone was formal, legal, but the intent was obvious. She was being warned. One more incident, and she'd be suspended pending review. He folded it again, handed it back. "This is ridiculous." "No. This is life. This is what happens when people like me let people like you in too close. It's not just a story, Julian. It's my job. My name. My whole reputation. You think I'm going to ruin you? I think you could. Without even trying." He stared at her, tried to read between the words, to find something she wasn't saying. He knew she was scared, not just of the letter, but of what it meant to want someone again. Wanting always meant risk. He got that. But he wasn't just some wide-eyed idiot trying to collect an experience to brag about. He hadn't felt this level of attention to another human being in years, maybe ever. "I'm not walking away," he said. You should. I won't. She laughed, but it was dry and didn't touch her eyes. That's the worst part. I believe you. They sat like that for a while, unmoving. When she finally stood, she didn't say goodbye. She just left the letter on the table and walked out without looking back. Julian picked it up again, folded it into his pocket, and stayed there until the cafe emptied. Something had changed. The game was no longer harmless. They had been seen. Someone had turned their curiosity into a threat. And for the first time, he realized they weren't the only ones writing the story anymore. Julian started showing up late at night instead. No more bookstore steps, no more casual meetings in daylight. He waited until campus emptied, until the hallway stopped echoing with conversations and laughter and questions about deadlines. That's when she would sometimes appear, always walking quickly, carrying a worn leather bag, never looking up until he stepped into her path. They didn't speak much during those encounters. Sometimes a quiet nod, sometimes just a pause long enough for their eyes to meet and hold. He learned the rhythm of her silence, and she learned he wasn't asking her to break it. They weren't avoiding the world, not exactly. They were just pushing it to the edges, letting their words exist in the space between obligation and impulse. One night she didn't let him just walk her to her car. She didn't say anything, just unlocked the door and waited. He climbed in, hands on his knees, not sure what came next. She drove out of the city without asking if he had somewhere to be. He didn't. She took the long road west, the one that curved around the reservoir and dropped into a stretch of woods no one visited after dark. It was quiet, and the headlights lit nothing but gravel and trees and the occasional deer that didn't bother to move until the car was almost on top of it. She pulled into a dirt lot at the edge of the water, shut off the engine, and finally looked at him. "This is where I come when I need to feel like I still exist," she said. Julian didn't ask why she needed that. He understood without having to hear the rest. She had spent so many years pretending, adjusting, reducing herself to whatever fit. Wife. Professor. Figure of authority. He saw the way she straightened her spine when she walked past colleagues, the way her face stiffened when anyone young and loud passed her office door. She had been surviving through control, and he was the one thing she hadn't planned for. "I used to come out here with my sister," she said. "Before everything fell apart." What happened? She trusted someone she shouldn't have. Then she blamed me for not stopping it. Could you have? I don't know. Maybe. I was too busy trying to save my own marriage. I ignored the signs. Julian sat back, looked out the windshield at the black stillness of the lake. He had his own stories, but they always felt unfinished, always ended in confusion instead of closure. His mother left when he was 15. No explanation, just a suitcase and a voicemail. His father never talked about it, just disappeared into work and cheap whiskey and silence that settled into every room like dust. "People keep telling me time fixes everything," he said. "But I think it just gives you more chances to lie to yourself." She turned toward him and didn't say anything. Not for a long time. When she finally did speak, her voice was calm. "You're too young to be this clear. You're too tired to pretend you don't want something real." Her head dropped back against the headrest, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked her age. Not in a bad way, just in a way that said she had lived through enough nights like this to know they rarely ended cleanly. Still, she leaned across the console and kissed him without hesitation. It wasn't a kiss filled with hunger or fear. It was steady, deliberate, the kind that carries the weight of thought, not impulse. When she pulled back, she didn't say sorry, and he didn't ask for more. They stayed in the car until the inside windows fogged, until the only sound was the soft buzz of night insects outside and the barely audible beat of the clock on the dash. They started meeting there often, never planning it, just arriving within minutes of each other as if their thoughts had synced. They talked about everything except the obvious, what they were becoming, what people would think, what it meant. The pressure was there, growing, but they didn't name it. Naming things made them real in ways they couldn't afford. He brought her a copy of a novel he had underlined to death. She brought him half a bottle of whiskey and let him sip it while she laughed at his reactions. He made fun of the way she overpronounced French names. She mocked his playlists. Then it happened. They were leaving the reservoir when a pair of headlights swept across them at the exit. Clara froze. The other car didn't stop, didn't slow, just passed by, but her posture changed instantly. Julian looked in the mirror but didn't recognize the vehicle. She didn't speak until they were halfway back to the city. "I think that was one of my students," she said. "The quiet one. He's in the back row. I've caught him staring." Julian sat up straighter. "Do you think he saw us?" "He saw the car. Maybe the plates. Maybe us. I don't know. What are you going to do?" "Nothing. Yet." When she dropped him off, she didn't kiss him, didn't say anything except go in through the back so no one sees. Then she drove away without waiting for a response. Inside his apartment, Julian couldn't sleep. He lay in bed thinking about how quickly things could collapse, how a single glance from the wrong person could erase weeks of something that had started to feel important. They had kept everything hidden, not out of shame, but out of self-defense. Now that wasn't enough. He checked his phone again and again that night, but no messages came. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if this was still theirs to protect. The call came during the middle of his Friday class, right as the professor started going over something he should have been paying attention to. Julian didn't recognize the number, but something in him said to answer anyway. He slipped out of the lecture hall and pressed the phone to his ear, trying to stay calm. The voice on the other. When Tuesday came, he put on a collared shirt and walked into the hotel where the conference was being held. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't faculty. He wasn't even on the list. But he slipped through the back, stayed quiet, kept his head down, and found a seat near the back of the main conference room where Clara would be speaking. The panel was on literary ethics, a topic she could crush in her sleep, but she looked pale under the overhead lights, hair pulled tight, every move deliberate. She took the podium like it was a weapon she didn't want to use. He watched her read through her notes, each word precise, clipped. Her voice never cracked, but it lacked something. He didn't say anything. She waited, then hung up without another word. That night, he sat in his apartment, stared at the ceiling, then called his father for the first time in 3 months. He expected the usual cold tone, the same impatient breathing in clipped sentences, but something in his voice cracked when he asked, "Did you ever tell Mom the truth about what happened?" There was a pause. A long one. "No." "Why not?" "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. People hear what they want. And once they've decided who you are, the truth just makes you easier to punish." Julian hung up without responding. He didn't need to hear more. The meeting was scheduled for 9:30. Clara went in first. He waited outside the office, watching the second hand on the wall clock. At exactly 10, they called him in. The room smelled like toner and coffee. 3 people sat behind a long table, each with folders and notes and expressions that made it clear the script had been written in advance. They asked about his relationship with Professor Baines, about the nature of their conversations, the frequency of their interactions. They asked whether he had ever received preferential treatment, whether he had ever been in her office after hours. The tone wasn't hostile, but it was firm, designed to push him toward one conclusion, that something had happened, and that denying it would only make things worse for both of them. He answered carefully. Yes, they had spoken outside of class. No, she had never graded him, supervised him, or taught him directly. Yes, they had become close. No, she had never crossed a line professionally. When they asked if the relationship had been personal, he paused. He looked at each of them. None looked back at him with curiosity, only the dull stare of people doing a job. So he said what he had decided the night before. Yes. We were involved. They wrote it down. No one gasped. No one seemed surprised. The meeting ended 2 minutes later. Outside, Clara was gone. He didn't hear from her that day. Or the next. By the end of the week, word had spread. Not details, not names, but enough. People whispered in halls. Some looked at him with curiosity. A few others, mostly women, avoided his gaze. One professor pulled him aside and told him he'd made things complicated for a lot of people. He didn't reply. He just kept moving. It wasn't until Sunday that she texted. "Are you home?" He replied. "Yeah." 10 minutes later she was outside his door, not dressed for a visit, not made up, not polished. Just Clara. She stepped in without waiting for an invitation and stood by the window for a long time before speaking. "They gave me two choices. Resign quietly, or face a formal inquiry with suspension." Julian stayed quiet. "I resigned." "Did they offer you anything?" "A reference letter. A suggestion I take time to reflect." That was the word they used. Reflect. He waited. She didn't move from the window. She was staring at the street like it was going to disappear. "I thought maybe I could stay angry about it," she said. "Blame the rules. Blame the cowardice. But what hurts is that I kept telling myself I could hold both things. My job and this thing with you. And I couldn't. You think I was the mistake?" "No. I think I couldn't admit that I wanted something enough to risk losing everything else." She turned then, looked at him for the first time since walking in. "I should have said something sooner. I should have owned it. Instead, I let them decide how it ended." "You didn't let them. They just did." "No." I froze. I chose silence. They stood in the same room, only a few feet apart, but it felt like miles. He wanted to say something that would make it better, but everything felt too final. Too obvious. "So what now?" he asked. "I'm leaving." "For good?" "For a while. I need to be somewhere they don't know my face." He nodded. She moved toward him. They didn't hug. They didn't kiss. They just stood still. Then she reached out, touched his wrist, and held it for a second longer than she needed to. "You changed something in me," she said. "And not many people get to do that." He watched her walk out the door without looking back. The silence she left behind wasn't heavy or tragic. It just was. He never told anyone the full story. Not because he was ashamed. Not because he regretted it. But because it wasn't something other people needed to understand. Some things don't fit into categories. Some connections don't survive exposure. That didn't make them any less real. Weeks passed. Then months. Life kept moving, always forward. He checked his phone less. He stopped avoiding campus buildings. He finished his classes, kept his head down, started planning next steps. But sometimes, late at night, he found himself replaying the sound of her voice when she said his name like it mattered. And every time, he wondered the same thing. If she called just once, what would he say? He didn't know. And maybe that was the point.